All right, thank you very much, Ed, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I want to welcome you all to our upgrading webinar. You can see that we've got a few people on the screen now. I'll introduce my co-host, David Thurmond. And we've also got, David, you're on mute there. Sorry, but he says hi. And we've got our panelists, Manjula Ezra.
Hello.
Carly McCann.
Hi.
And Ash King.
Hi.
So with that in mind, we'll kick off. I'm sure you're all keen to see what we've got in store for you tonight. So we just get this up and shared. So upgrading your home, what we're all here to see tonight. We're going to have a few topics that we're going to be covering off tonight, obviously all around upgrading your home. Before we do get started though, I want to introduce our team a little bit further. A lot of them you already know, you deal with them throughout an application process. You might have spoken to them with an initial inquiry. We're going to be going through what's happening in the property market, what kind of numbers you need to know. We'll dive into that quite deeply, and a case study to kind of tie it all together. So first off, I'm going to run through our team. So as you can see, we have quite a few people in our team. Up here, you've met us, David Thurmond, Manjula Ezra, myself, Carly, and Alston. We also have here in the office as our commercial specialist. The middle row we've got here, these are the most familiar names, I'm sure, for most of you. We've got Ricky, Becky, Juliana handling our applications, Bianca handling our client reviews, and Taylor as our compliance manager, making sure everything is spick and span, and Tracy and Ash down the bottom, our marketing managers. So bigger team than many of you may have met, but yeah, keep in mind we're all here, we're all part of it. You've also seen our office in Berwick. So some of you may not have, but this is our office in Berwick. We've been here for just on 7 years now, and loving it. It's a great space. So, that's about it for our team. Again, a lot of you know what we do as a mortgage broker, but to kind of sum it up, what we do is we find the best loan for you. We make sure that we find the best interest rate, the lender that's going to lend you the amount that you need. That's really important, obviously. And we want to make sure that it's affordable to you. So we do all of that compliance check in the background. It's important to keep in mind as well that banks pay us. Our commission is paid by the bank. So our service to you is free for the most part. There are some terms and conditions there, of course, but for the bulk of it, our service is free, paid commission by the bank. Now, what kind of lenders do we have on our panel? I'm sure you're curious. We have over 30 lenders on our panel, ranging from the big four to online only lenders like ING, and of course, some smaller banks that you can see there, Kudos Bank, and Newcastle Permanent, they're all on our panel. We need to find the lender that suits you best, not just for rate or for fees, but especially when upgrading your home, what kind of lender is going to lend the most, the amount that you need. And if we're looking at a bridging option, what kind of lenders will actually allow that? Certainly not the whole 30. And of the few that will, if you're not with that lender already and you need to move to that lender, creates a whole another pile of paperwork for us to do in the background. So that's why it's important to keep in mind, although we do have a large lending panel, finding the right one is very, very important. Next up, I want to pass over to my co-host, David Thurmond, and he's going to run through what's happening in the property market.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. Hopefully I'm not on mute. You guys can all hear me just fine. I'm really excited about this topic, upgrading your family home, because it's, as a broker and been doing this for 15 years, this is probably the most complex discussion or complex process that you can go through in finance. It's really easy to buy your first home because there's just one transaction to worry about. And when you buy an investment property, again, it's just one transaction. But normally when you're upgrading your family home, you've got to worry about a purchase and a sale. All right. So it makes it quite a complex discussion. And I think it's really important that we have these discussions with clients quite early in the piece so that we make sure that we're well organized and that the clients are aware of their options. I want to touch briefly on the property market and the state of the economy before we get into actually upgrading. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about inflation, interest rates, and the actual property market itself. To start, let's discuss inflation. It's kind of the elephant in the room. It's something that we've all been hearing in the news for the last 4 or 5 months, especially. And it's something that we'll be continuing to hear for the next 12 to 18 months because it's going to be an issue ongoing for a while. And it's going to dictate a lot of what happens in the market around interest rates, around borrowing capacity, and also property value. So I think it's super important that you at least have a basic understanding of what inflation is and how it might affect you. So in simple terms, inflation is just the rise in the cost of goods and services, all right? If you buy something today, then it's going to be more expensive tomorrow based on inflation. So as an example, if we just use easy math and just say, all right, well, what is an example of 10% inflation? If you have a television in 2021 that cost you $2,000, in 2022, that same television is going to cost you $2,200, okay? How will inflation affect you? Well, it means higher interest rates. The Reserve Bank is using interest rates to curb inflation. Their theory is that if they increase interest rates, we will have less money in our pockets to spend on goods and services because we're paying more for our mortgage. And hopefully that then brings down the cost of everything because there's less demand. It's a very blunt instrument, and it's the only tool the Reserve Bank has to try and manipulate inflation. Inflation will also affect building costs. We've already seen massive increases in building costs and delays with supply, but they're saying up to 20 or 30% of increased building costs. And basically everything is more expensive. So petrol is more expensive. You saw lettuce a couple of months ago was quite expensive because of the floods in Queensland and New South Wales. So there are a number of things that have been impacted. And I just think overall, everything in our lives have just become more expensive. In this chart here, I don't want to scare everyone, but you can see the increase in inflation over the last, say, 6 to 12 months. These gray bars reflected here are the target band that the Reserve Bank wants to keep inflation in. And we are well above that target band. Now, a lot of this black line here going up dramatically has a lot to do with the war in Ukraine because petrol prices and fuel prices have gone through the roof. And also things like floods that have impacted building materials and produce and whatnot. So a lot of the things are out of our control. And then the only thing that the Reserve Bank can do to try to get things back into control is to increase interest rates. The prediction is that we're not going to see inflation return to this target band here until the middle of 2024. So that means that interest rates will likely remain high between now and, say, the end of 2023 to 2024. On the right-hand side of this chart, you can see some of the areas that are most affected. You can see transport's the number one area that's been affected, and that's mainly because of petrol prices going up, and then housing at 9% increase. Now, this is up to June 2022. I think when the new CPI numbers come out for these categories next month, we'll see a fair increase over all of them. And that leads us to the next discussion, and that's around interest rates. Now, over the last 6 months, we've seen that in February of 2022, the cash rate was sitting at 0.1%. And then over the last 5 months, we've seen nothing but increases. It started back in May when we saw 0.25% increase. And then we've had 0.5% increases every month for the last 4 months to put the cash rate now at 2.35%. And if you look at this on its own in just the last 6 months, it seems quite scary. It seems like, it's a bit of doom and gloom and things are only going up. But if we zoom out a little bit and we look at interest rates over the last 20 years, so this chart is showing you from February 2000 to current, and you can see the journey that interest rates have taken over that period of time. And how fortunate we are, even with the current interest rates where they are, compared to what they were, say, 2013 and before, we're still doing okay. And the prediction is that we will see a little bit more of an increase over the next few months. And then it's likely the Reserve Bank will put things on pause and wait and see what their increases have done to inflation. And then in the end of 2023 to early 2024, the market is predicting that we'll start to see rates coming back down because the Reserve Bank would then need to stimulate the economy and encourage people to spend, and they'll decrease interest rates to do that. Okay, so still a lot to play out with interest rates, but it looks like there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel where inflation is starting to become less of a concern. Hopefully that means they can slow down the rate rises and we'll get closer to the rates coming back down again. Now, how will higher interest rates affect you? Well, obviously it means reduced cash flow because if you're paying more for your mortgage each month, then you've got less money to spend on everything else in your life. And it also means reduced borrowing capacity. So for those of you that are thinking of purchasing a new home, it means that you're going to be able to borrow less. You need to either have more in savings or more from your sale to increase that purchase price. The last area that we want to talk about before we get into the actual main topic of tonight's discussion is property values. And we'll quickly look at a chart that shows you what's happened with property values over the last, say, 8 years, 6 years, 7 years maybe. The main area to look at initially is going to be this drop here. We see that regional properties are down by 21%, and we see that capital cities across Australia are down by 12%. And if you look at that on its own, you think, okay, well, that doesn't look that great. We're seeing a definite softening in the property market. But I think it's worth taking a bit of perspective and looking at the rises that we've seen since 2019, because property values have increased from 2019 all the way through COVID and up to the beginning of this year. We had a 30% increase in property values. So the property values currently could drop a fair bit more. And those of us that have had property since 2019 would still be doing quite well. We'd still have a fair bit of equity in place. And equity is the key. Equity is what we want to help with that next purchase. So we see that interest rates are starting to, sorry, not interest rates, but property prices are starting to come down. And I mentioned that word perspective. If we look at Melbourne specifically, so this is our beautiful Melbourne area, and we see the southeast suburbs here in this purple box. We've actually seen the 4% growth in Melbourne since the start of the year. And when you compare that with other suburbs, especially the inner suburbs where you might see multi-million-dollar properties in more affluent areas, those are the areas that have had the biggest hit in property value. So the outer suburbs have actually done okay, both in the southeast and in the west. The other thing I wanted to touch on quickly is the strength of our lending environment in Australia. I get a lot of clients that are a bit concerned about the scrutiny that our banks put them under when they're trying to borrow. And while it is sometimes frustrating to have to answer a bunch of questions about your borrowing capacity and your capacity to lend, there's good reason for it. Basically, it means that our banks are incredibly safe when you compare them to other areas in the world. So if you think back to the financial crisis, when there were massive issues in Europe and the US, Australia didn't experience that. We actually experienced a lot of growth during the financial crisis because our lending environment was different. We had strict rules that prevented some of the catastrophes that happened overseas. And we're seeing that still today because the lending environment is very conservative. This chart is showing you the 90-day arrears rates since the third quarter of 2020, and they've come down. So what this is saying basically is that 0.7% of clients that have mortgages are 90 days in arrears, which is fantastic. And it's the lowest rate that we've had since the year 2000. All right. So in the grand scheme of things, while it looks like, with interest rates increasing and property values coming down a little bit, that you might have some concern, but this is telling me that we're actually doing quite well as a whole in the economy. There will be some difficult times. Some of our clients are experiencing a bit of mortgage stress with these higher rates, but in the grand scheme of things, we're doing okay. I'll hand it back over to David to discuss the main topic tonight, which is upgrading.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think perspective is definitely the key there. There's all the doom and gloom, as you said, in the media, and providing that zoom out of the big picture is really important to see every now and then. So yeah, thank you. So upgrading, what we're all here for tonight. There are a few key points that we're going to run through when it comes to upgrading. First one is knowing your numbers. Second is knowing your budget. And third is knowing your timeline. Now, with your numbers, this is probably the most important aspect of upgrading your home. So when we're talking about knowing your numbers, we're talking about how much you owe on your current property, how much you expect to sell for, and of course, how much savings you have. These three aspects are very important. Obviously, the debt that you owe on your current property is going to impact how much proceeds you receive from the sale. The sale price is going to impact how much proceeds you receive from the sale. And if those figures do not cover the purchase, or they do not cover enough of the purchase to allow you to borrow what you need, how much savings do you have to cover that gap? The three very important factors when it comes to numbers. Second part is your budget. How much can you actually afford to borrow? So you might have sales proceeds of $200,000. You need to borrow 600, but you can only afford 5. What do we do? Will you keep your existing home, or will you sell as part of the move? This is something we'll only touch on briefly. For the majority of our discussion, we'll be talking about selling, but this is definitely an aspect that you need to consider. And finally, pre-approval. Pre-approvals are more important now than ever. With the rate rises, pre-approvals with some banks will actually lock in how much you can afford. And that's for 90 days, the pre-approval period. So for instance, if today you get a pre-approval for a purchase of $600,000, as rates increase, you can no longer afford that purchase price. However, with the pre-approval in place, that remains for the 90 days. So it really gives you a leg up if you're not quite ready to purchase. You know that you can lock in your affordability and really get ready. So third, not least, but third is the timeline. So especially when you're selling, do you buy or do you sell first? What's involved with buying and what's involved with selling to make sure that you're ready from each aspect. Is your house actually ready to list? A lot of clients will need to do minor renovations to their house before they list. That's something an agent can advise you of, and definitely want to make sure that you do that before you list. And the third point is the deposit for the new purchase. This one kind of gets swept under the rug a little bit when clients are considering an upgrade, but when you purchase, you need a deposit. Do you have cash ready? Do you need to borrow against your current property's equity to access that cash and have that ready before you start to sell, before you look at purchasing? So they're really important aspects to consider when you're purchasing and especially selling. And so we want to run through a bit of a case study. And so I'm going to hand it back to David to run through some numbers.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Everything that David just mentioned is super important, but especially knowing your timeline. I think it's critical that you have a good understanding of your timeline, and we'll touch on that now. So let's get into a case study. If we look at selling your existing home, the scenario that we'll use is that a client has a $330,000 mortgage and a property that's worth $640,000. And their goal is to sell the existing home and purchase a new home. And they want to purchase for $1 million. All right, so we'll slide over. And I've got the data entered here. What we're looking at are two scenarios. We've got the current structure here, and we've got the proposed purchase on this side here. So we'll look at the current structure first. We've got an existing home worth $640,000, and we've got debt or a mortgage of $330,000. And we can see that the client's loan to value ratio is at 51.5%. So they own almost half that property. For the proposed structure, we're purchasing a property for $1 million. And when you purchase for $1 million, we also need to factor in the upfront costs that you would have. And a good rule of thumb is to assume about 6% as a cost for anyone purchasing a property. So on $1 million, you're looking at $1,060,000 that would cover the stamp duty, transfers, registrations, and legal fees. Now, we need to work out the sales proceeds. So we'll slide over to our selling costs. And if we put in $640,000 as our sale price, and then assume that the agent is going to get about $21,000 in agent's fees, marketing, and conveyancing, and then we're clearing the existing mortgage of $330,000. And then some clients might want to keep $20,000 set aside from the sale to cover things like painting the new house, new carpeting, potentially furniture, maybe minor renovations that you want to do. So you need to have a think about, does the property that you're purchasing need additional funds to make it livable? And if that's the case, then we can reserve some funds from the sale. So in this case, we've got $269,000 that can go towards the purchase, and we've got $20,000 that will be kept as proceeds to go towards minor renovations. If we go back to our case study, we've got a debt of $1,060,000, and we take away $269,000 in proceeds. That leaves us with a loan of $791,000. So the end result is that we have a loan of $791,000 secured against a property worth $1 million, and our loan to value ratio is 79.10%. Right, and so we can see that we're well under 80%. We don't need lender's mortgage insurance, and we should be good to go as far as the structure. When it comes to borrowing, there are two things that we focus on. One is the structure of the loan, and that's what we're covering off now. The other side of the coin is borrowing capacity. How much can you afford to pay? Can you afford that loan of $791,000? And for this scenario, we'll assume that the client's borrowing capacity is good to go. All right, so we'll assume that the structure is good and the borrowing capacity is good. So the only thing that we now need to discuss is how we actually physically relocate from one house to the other. And this is the discussion that David mentioned earlier about your timeline. For the majority of clients, it's best that you sell your property first. The reason why we want you to sell first is that you can then control how long you have to find another property to find that purchase. So for example, in this scenario, we've got a client that sells their home. They organize a long settlement period, maybe 120 days. And that gives them time to go out and find a new property and then try and simultaneously settle on both the sale and the purchase on the same day. 90% of our clients will do simultaneous settlement where we've got the sale and the purchase happening on the same day. As you can imagine, there's a little bit of extra stress involved when you've got two transactions tied together and needing to go through at the same time. But it does happen all the time, and it is the norm in the industry. So this is quite common, but it does require that you sell first. If you purchased first, we can't get an unconditional approval on your sale because you haven't sold and we don't know what the proceeds are yet. So normally clients are having to sell their property first. For those clients that have a fair bit of equity in their existing home, they may have the option of doing bridging finance. And bridging finance would allow you to actually purchase first. So in this scenario, a client purchases and they settle on that purchase on the 1st of June. And then they've organized the sale of the property, but the sale doesn't go through until the 1st of July. So for 1 month, we've got a period where you're carrying two mortgages. You've got the existing mortgage of $330,000, and you've got the new mortgage of just over $1 million because we haven't yet reduced it yet from the sales proceeds. So for a short period of time, you've got a total of $1.3 million in debt that you have to make repayments on. Normally, clients will pay between $100 and $200 a day in interest while they carry a bridging period. And you can have this bridging period to be as short or as long as you want it to be. It can be as little as a couple of days. It could be as long as 12 months. As long as you have enough savings to cover that interest during that bridging period, the bank will let you go up to 12 months. Now, as an example, my wife and I bought our family home about 5 years ago, and we used bridging finance for about 2 weeks to allow us a nice leisurely transfer from one house to the next. We purchased our home, we got painting done, we got carpets done, the little minor renovations that you had to do, replacing doors and whatever else that needed to be done. It just gave us time to get the house tidied up and livable and to our liking. And then it gave us time to leisurely transfer from one house to the next. And then it also gave us time to get the existing house cleaned up so that we weren't in a rush and scrambling around. I've got 3 young kids, and the last thing that we wanted to do was to be under pressure and trying to rush out of the existing home and rush into the new home. All right. So the bridging period, while it is a little bit more expensive, it does provide you a greater deal of convenience because you do have that time to transfer, and it also allows you to purchase first. Regardless of what you choose to do first, whether it's to purchase or to sell, you are then putting pressure on the next transaction. So if you purchase first, you're then trying to sell as quickly as possible so that you're reducing your bridging period. If you sell first, you're then putting pressure on the purchase because now you've got a specific time where you need to be out of your house and into the new home. All right. So I think it's good to always go into these situations knowing that there's a lot involved. It's quite complex, and you need to have good advice to ensure that you do it properly. That's it for a case study. I'll hand it back over to David.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's again really important to see that there are multiple ways of doing this, especially when it comes to the timing. So speaking to a specialist is really, really important. So that's kind of where we step in. We make sure that the mortgage broker, we make sure that that you've got the timing all lined up well before we even get to that point. We make sure that your borrowing capacity is all lined up well before you get to that point. So really, really important that you speak to us as soon as you can. A bit of a checklist, we'll get this sent out to you, but as a bit of a summary, when you purchase, you need to keep in mind what kind of purchase price you're going to walk away with or walk away from. The sale price, again, same kind of thing. What kind of price are you happy to sell for? That's your line in the sand. And the timeline. Where do you see your sale and your purchase landing? Where do you see an interim living situation if there is a gap in between, if we're not bridging? So we'll get that checklist sent out to you guys. And we're also going to send some charts for you guys. So this is exactly what you were seeing David use earlier. It is blank. We can always run through this with you individually, but this will give you a great start, and we'll get these sent out after the webinar. I want to mention a few things that you need to be mindful of, and it is, again, reiterating some of the really important factors of buying and selling. When you buy first, you're giving yourself a specific timeline that you need to sell within, and that can put pressure on the sale price. It can put pressure on aesthetic renovations, and it can put a lot of stress on you. So that's something you really need to keep in mind. Same kind of thing with selling. If you sell first, you're putting a lot of pressure on the purchase. Can you line up the settlements? Do you need to move out of the home and find somewhere to rent or live with the in-laws for 6 to 12 months while you find a new house? What's going to work for you, and what are you happy to proceed with? And finally, as I mentioned with the pre-approvals, borrowing capacity is going to change, especially over the next 3 to 6 months as rates continue to rise. So making sure that your capacity is locked in, making sure that your purchase price is as guaranteed as we can make it is really important. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that you've lined up as many ducks as you can before you start to proverbial shoot. Don't want to shoot any ducks, but I hope you know what I mean. Now, in summary, that is the gist of our slides tonight, of our presentation tonight. So a bit of a summary. You need to know your numbers. That's a given. You need to make sure that you have a minimum sale price that you're happy to walk away with, and you need to have a maximum purchase price in mind as well. All of these things tie into your capacity and making sure that we can actually make this transition work. Alongside the sale price and the purchase price is, of course, the financial position. Do your income and living arrangements actually allow for this purchase price and that sale price? And finally, the time frame to make it all work within. So really, really important details that I strongly suggest you speak with us about before you get the ball rolling. So that's really the next step. My slides are frozen. That is the next step. Booking in a meeting with us and making sure that you've got everything as lined up as possible before you take that first step to sell or to purchase, whichever transition we're looking at. I did want to mention as well that alongside making the numbers work, alongside making a plan for moving from one house to the next, it can be much longer term. I've got an example of a client that I was speaking with last year who really wanted to move to Frankston South because they're looking to move their daughter into a better school. They need to sell their house and they need to upgrade to a house within that zone, the catchment zone. We're putting together a 3 to 5 year plan by the time that the daughter's old enough to move to that school, a 3 to 5 year plan to make sure that they've built up enough equity in their home. They're moving up in terms of promotions at work or building up their business to make sure their income is going to be sufficient. And it's a long-term plan to make sure that they can reach their goals. So 6 to 12 months is, the general time frame that people start to look at upgrading. it can move much faster, it can move much slower. So really important that you speak with us and we make sure that we've got everything lined up, as I said. Now, I see that we've had a few questions come through, so I'd like to open up to the panelists, and then we might start replying to some of these.
Thanks, David. Yeah, we've had a few questions come through. I might go through them and pass them on to Carly and Manjula, if you don't mind. Carly, I might start with you, if you don't want to pass these questions to Manjula. With equity, what's the minimum equity a client needs to allow for bridging?
So that can be a really complicated question. It really depends on what sort of equity you have in your current home and how much you're looking to upgrade your property by. So it's really a discussion best had one-on-one. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine, no problems. If another question that's come through, if I obtain a bridging loan based on a certain sale price, but it's sells for less, what happens in that situation?
Great question. So the banks do build in a buffer. It's generally around about 10%. Obviously, they have their own rules. So it's really important, I guess, that you lower your expectation initially as to what you would sell your property for. And it sort of gives a bit of a wider gap as to what you'd need for bridging, but would cover any sort of contingencies for if you sell for less.
No problems. I've just had a question come through too for those attending. If you do want to book a meeting with one of our brokers, I've just popped in a link in the answers to each of the brokers that you can book a link to post the meeting to speak about something more specific to your situation. What if I don't sell my house in time? I might leave that one for you too, Carly, if that's all right.
Sure, getting all the bridging questions tonight. So the banks allow you 6 to 12 months to sell your property if you haven't already sold it at the time that you come to us for finance. It's a really good idea for you to get that sold as quick as possible. Sorry, just to reduce the amount of interest that you're paying, but you have 6 to 12 months to sell that property from the date your new property settled.
Okay, sure. I might get you involved, Manjula, if you don't mind. A couple of questions that have come through too. If I don't want to sell first, but I've recently spoken to my bank and they don't offer bridging finance, can I move to a lender who will?
Yes, you can refinance to a lender who offers bridging finance, but there are limitations. We'll reach out to you after the webinar to discuss your situations further.
I think that's a really, sorry, Ash, I think it's a really good question that was raised. There are not many banks that allow bridging finance. Usually it's just the major lenders that allow it. And there also are only 1 or 2 lenders that will allow a refinance and bridging finance. And what that means is, let's say that you're with ING, for example, and ING doesn't allow bridging finance. If you need bridging finance, you need to refinance your existing loan to a lender that will allow a refinance and bridging. So it comes back to what David Elaine was saying earlier, where the earlier we can speak to you, the better, to ensure that we've got the right lender lined up for you. Because it's not always about interest rates. Sometimes it's just about finding a lender that will actually do the transaction. Because when you're upgrading your home, we've got fewer and fewer lenders to choose from.
Okay. Hi, Anna. Thank you for your question. Anna's just asking, is upgrading her home a good financial strategy? If so, how? It might be more of an individual question, but I guess if we're looking at that, would you consider it a good time to still upgrade your home in this current environment?
Yeah, I'll take over on that one. It is definitely an individual question, so we'll reach out to you to discuss this further. But I think what you need to keep in mind is what is your financial goal? Is your goal to have a really large property, unencumbered, no debt when you retire? Is your goal to build as big a portfolio as you can before retirement? So there's a lot of factors that go into it in terms of, is it a good financial strategy or not? Yeah, that's something that we'll have to discuss with you a little bit further. So
okay, yeah, that's fine.
Just to add to that, Ash, I think when you're looking at upgrading your home, usually it's a lifestyle decision. You're doing it to provide a better home for your family, either in a better location for school or just a bigger home in general, because you've now got more kids and more stuff. So I think upgrading your family home is usually lifestyle. If you're looking at wealth creation, property certainly is a way of doing that. And you might also look at potentially keeping the existing home as an investment, or thinking, 5 to 10 years down the track about upgrading your home now, selling the existing home, upgrading your home, and then potentially buying an investment property again down the track.
Okay, sure. Another question we had come in a bit earlier, Manjula, this might be a good one for you actually. What happens to redraw with a client if they do decide to upgrade their property? They've got a certain amount of redraw, say $20,000 or $5,000 of redraw in the property. What happens with that when they upgrade?
It is a very good question. I get asked this question quite a bit, Ash.
Okay.
When you sell, you're required to clear the loan balance. Any redraw will then be paid to you as sales proceeds.
Okay, sure. Perfect. I've got another. Hi, Fiona. Thank you for your question. Fiona's asking, she's talking about owning her own property around 1 million and retiring. She's gone on to say, do I need a job to do a bridging if I buy first and my current home is well over the new purchase price? She's been with NAB over 30 years.
Yeah, very, very good question. So I think what Fiona is after is what we call no end debt bridging. So it's where you, just as Fiona's outlined, she's going to purchase a home that is less than the current value of her existing home. And she's basically going to be left with no debt. And as you can appreciate, most lenders want to make money, and they don't make money when you don't have a mortgage at the very end. So there's only one lender on our panel that will do a no end debt bridging loan. So what we would need to do is either refinance Fiona's existing loan to that lender, or discuss other ways in which we could make it work. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, feel free to book in an appointment. I've popped in the links. If you've got any more questions, please feel free to quickly ask them. But we'll send out a recording of the webinar tomorrow. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the brokers. A few more questions that have popped through. Jason's asking, we live separately and are looking to upgrade into one home. I assume we will need to sell our one of our homes and move into one home to make the sale process easier. So I've buggered that question up a little. Do you want me to reread that one?
No, I can see the question there. That does make sense. So living separately and looking to upgrade. Again, it is a little bit of an individual situation. That's our general response at the moment. If you can afford to keep the property and that is what you wish to do, then we can look at that option. We can look at using equity in the current home to purchase the new home together. If that doesn't work, then we do need to consider selling. And again, that'll come down to the time frame of selling first or a bridging loan.
Sure. I can't see any that have popped through. But as I said, yeah, if anybody else does have any questions, please feel free to email the brokers after the meeting. That might be it, David. I might pass it back to you in case we don't have any last questions.
Yeah, no, I think that is it. Well, look, thank you everybody for joining tonight. I do really appreciate you taking the time on this evening, and a big thank you to my co-host David and the panelists Carly, Manjula, and Ash. So as Ash said, we'll get the link sent out so you can make the meeting bookings with us if you see fit, and we will get a copy of this webinar sent out to you tomorrow as well. So thank you again for the time, and look forward to speaking soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.